Welcome to the Prof Talk Pod, brought to you by the Engaged Professor. Every 2 weeks, join us as we talk about tips and tricks to help you connect with your students, engage with industry, and stay up to date on all the teaching trends. We'll give you actionable strategies that will help improve your teaching today. Thank you for being here. Let's get started. Hi and welcome. My name is Becky Aiken, and I am here with my co-host, friend, colleague, Galen Clavio. And I'm pretty excited about this episode's topic, and partially because at a most recent teaching, we called it Bites and Best Practices on our campus, it was just an opportunity to talk about teaching experiences and learn from each other. We talked about the Chronicle of Higher Ed that published a report. They did some research in 2024. They published a report about teaching Gen Z students. And I realized during this professional development session that for the most part, I have almost always taught Gen Z students, like maybe some people on the bubble who were younger millennials, and some grad students I've had that have coming back to school have been millennial or Gen Xers. But for the most part, I've always taught Gen Z students. And so we were having conversations about this report that had 6 things that they kind of found were different about Gen Z students. So I was excited to talk about this because I think Galen might have had a few more millennials, not a lot more, but a few more millennial students
Quite a few millennials
than I had. So, and most of my millennial students would have been when I was a graduate teaching assistant, which while I got to teach full classes, they were my classes. I taught every lecture. It still was different as a TA than it is as a faculty member. So some of those elements that the Chronicle of Higher Ed found are actually things that connect well to some of the topics we've talked about in the past. So we've talked a little bit about needing to share the value in our classes and our programs and even in a day content and topic with students. And they actually found that too in the study, that students aren't necessarily challenging our expertise when they ask us why they're learning something. They legitimately want us to make the connection for them.
Yep.
And I think that ties really nicely to that idea of value that we've touched on a few times.
So it's interesting. I started teaching relatively young, and so we can classify, since we're talking specifically about generations. I actually classify myself as an elder millennial, even though I think by birth year I am technically still Gen X. So I was born in 1979. But I have always been a lot more millennial than Gen X in terms of my overall worldview, my adaptation of technology. I was a very early internet adopter, things like that. I started teaching in college at age, how old was I? 26. And I was, at that point, I had kind of the heart of the millennial generation in college. And I've got a now former student who's a friend and colleague who I was kind of in my mind's like, that's kind of like the uber millennial. I now have someone in my program who I work with all the time who's a student who I call the uber Gen Zer or the uber Zennial. So I feel like I've hit the full spectrum here over the course of the last 20 years or so, and I've seen this entire changeover in terms of teaching. So it's a fascinating topic to me because there are a lot of interesting differences, but they're mostly small differences. And I actually don't think there's been that much of a change, at least not as much as people oftentimes argue that there has been.
Well, and I think that's interesting because one of the things that they found was students have changed, and so should teaching. But I actually thought, and I talked to some of my colleagues about this, and they kind of felt similarly that yeah, there are some differences, some small differences, but maybe it's not so much that students have changed and teaching needs to change, but the world that we live in has evolved, and therefore teaching has to change.
Yeah. I mean, you and I both work in and around sports. And one of the things you always hear about, coaching kids today, there's this loud chorus of kids today, don't work hard, don't do this or that. And then there's always this small but consistent chorus that says, well, kids haven't changed, but adults have. And what adults, like the millennials often got blamed for, the everyone gets a trophy culture in youth sports, not without anybody noticing the irony that the people who created the trophies were the adults, not the kids. So this is the kind of thing I think we have to think about in teaching, because I don't think there are that many major differences between millennial and Gen Z in terms of the in-class stuff. Now, I do think you brought up a couple things right off the bat that are worth noting. I do think that millennials were still pretty similar to Gen Xers in that they expected to go into a classroom, they expected to be handed a set of materials. The teacher had to almost become like the translator of what the textbook said, because the textbook was typically pretty dense and there wasn't another method for getting that information. But right as we did the changeover from millennials to Gen Z was really when the internet and the wealth of information on the internet became readily available to everybody. And even in the creative arts or in things like media production and content creation, suddenly the means of content creation were no longer tied up in what the professor was doing, and instead were things that, on the one hand, we're telling students, well, you could go do this on your phone at home, but on the other hand, we were like, well, no, you have to come to class and do these assignments because that's what we did. So I think the Gen Z, unlike millennials, has at their fingertips the wealth of information from the entirety of humanity, and they have the means of creating things on their own. And so I think that they have been, through the process of the college educational experience, they've asked some questions that are uncomfortable to the primarily Gen X and millennial teachers that they have, which is, why are we doing this? Like, what's the purpose? Why wouldn't we just do it this way, which seems a lot easier? Why are we insisting on doing it this way that you've probably done it for 10 or 15 years? And that is a threat. I've been talking about threats a lot in our recent podcast episodes, but I think that is perceived as a threat by faculty because it upsets the order of how they've set their courses up, and they don't really see they've bought into the idea that this is how you need to do things, and they don't feel like their authority should be questioned by a college student who couldn't possibly know what's best, even though in some cases the college students might actually have some points in terms of how they're asking these questions.
And they might literally just be asking. I mean, the report suggests they're asking because they actually want to know.
Right. And that's
That's a different, and you actually might find when you explain to them why, one of two things might happen. One, they're like, "Oh, I didn't think about that. That makes sense. I see why we start at X and go to Y and Z versus just going to Z."
right.
Or you might find out that there wasn't a great reason why, and you might need to evolve and change. And both of those things are good,
Yeah.
like long term.
I think a lot of the issues with Gen Z often come back to this idea that the questions that they ask are interpreted as insubordination in many cases, or a lack of desire to learn. And I don't find that about Gen Z at all, at least not in the Gen Z students that I teach. They do oftentimes reject the idea that it has to be done a certain way. And they often will put themselves in a position where, because of they assume they know more than they know because they are surrounded by information all the time, and they don't necessarily understand there's things outside of that. But I think you can't be offended by that because of the bubble that they often grow up in from a technological perspective, and that requires some adaptation as an instructor. I deal with this in media all the time. Like, my students now have different problems than my students did 15 years ago. My students 15 years ago didn't have the core skill sets for instance, recording video or editing video, because those were things that required equipment that cost tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars. You didn't have access to it in high schools. So, but these were kids that watched Sports Center and watched sports broadcasting and listened to radio and read newspapers. Like, they consumed all the content they could have. They needed help figuring out how to get from reading it to making it. Now, in this example, you've got kids who have grown up editing video and posting stuff on social media. And they know how to do the creation better than I could have taught it 15 years ago, but they don't consume the content. So they don't have anything to pattern after. And I think that's to me, it's a really good illustration of the core issues, one set of core issues with Gen Z, which is that the model for many of the things that we are trying to teach them has flipped. And it's less about the access to the information, and it's more about guiding them through what the information does for you in the pursuit of whatever you're going into. And that is a big paradigm shift in education, because we're so used to teaching people how to think. They oftentimes know how to think in this generation, but they don't know what to think about, which is and so trying to make those connections back and flip the model, I think, is part of, at least from my perspective, where you can make a lot of gains with Gen Z and trying to get them down the pathway to wherever you want them to go.
Well, and as you think about, they're asking why because they want to know we make a lot of assumptions that the connections are obvious. What I put in my syllabus is obviously topics we should be talking about in Introduction to Professional Performance. Shouldn't you know that? But they don't. We actually need to connect forward and connect back explicitly, which is kind of similar to what happens when you write a research paper and the reviewers come back and they say, you forgot to connect to past literature. You forgot to say the why. My favorite response in a review is the so what. I don't get the so what. We ask for it in research and we are fine with it. But then when our students ask the so what, we're like, well, don't you, isn't it obvious? Don't you just know? Shouldn't you just trust that the so what is because I said so, which we know how well that works if you have children. And it's a similar concept. So I think intentionally making those connections. 2 weeks ago, we talked about XYZ, and now we're going to go into talking more about it. We were talking about ethics in Introduction to Professional Performance and why entrepreneurs need to have a moral compass and how do you build ethical decision making models. And instead of just telling them, we need to know this, I gave them examples of situations where you have to make difficult decisions and why we need to have a moral framework for doing that versus shooting from the hip and hoping for the best. And then you could see their faces be like, oh, okay, so yeah, I don't really want to learn about Kantian ethics because I don't want to read this, book from a philosopher from hundreds of years ago. It's not quite that old, I don't think, but it feels that old. And then they understand, like, actually, I understanding this theory will help my brain process when I'm faced with a tough decision. And that kind of back and forth and connection between topics and across curriculum can speak to them. And if you just do it ahead of time, then they don't have to ask you why. And then you don't have to be offended because they question your authority because you just started off by telling them
Yep.
the why.
Yeah. Again, a lot of it, what seemed logical and honestly how education approaches tended to be structured over time was based upon, like, here's the corpus of knowledge and here's the process to get there. And it was all based upon the idea that the whole idea of college was, well, you get access to the knowledge at college because you can't get access to it anywhere else. You can get access to it now. So sometimes you're coming in, why are you interested in taking a class in the first place? Well, I read about this, or I saw a video on it, or something like that. Well, but that probably didn't give you everything. So you almost have to start from scratch, not assuming and this is a key point. And then I want to go to the other key point that I think really defines Gen X or Gen Z. But this is the key point. Every generation prior to this grew up in not every generation for the last 5 generations has grown up in a mass media environment where you had a small number of media channels, newspapers and television primarily, and everybody was watching the same thing. And there was a cultural currency that came about with that. There was an intellectual currency that came about from that does not exist, because now we are in a multipolar media world where everybody's watching their own individual stuff. If they're reading, they're probably reading their own individual stuff that's separate. So you've lost a lot of that consistency in terms of what people you would expect would come in with knowledge-wise, because half the time you're not even aware of the things that the classmates that you have in the class are aware of, because you might have grown up in Connecticut and they grew up in Kansas. So these are the kinds of things I think we got to think about. And I think it's, when when you got areas that are really heavily structured around here's how you learn, you go X and then Y and then Z. This is the first generation where we really do have to explain why. Whereas earlier generations, I think the way that information got passed along, that was where you understood, okay, I know I got to learn this because it leads to this. I don't think you can even make that assumption with Gen Z. The other thing to bounce back to you on, and I think this is something that we already forget about, Gen Z was forever altered in terms of what their intellectual development was going to be and how they experienced school by COVID. And you got to think right now, freshmen that you have in classes this year would have been in like seventh grade, I think, when COVID hit. And as a result, were probably remote for 6 months, a year and a half, had their learning experiences turned entirely upside down, did not have the normal progression of in person learning that millennials did, that Gen X did. And as a result, I think it has caused many of them to say, why do I need to go to class if I can just learn everything online? Why do I need to participate in this activity if I was able to go through my previous courses in middle school and in high school without having to do those things? And we did adapt at the college level. We had to go online for things, but then we came back in person, and many people immediately went back to teaching the way that they had taught pre-pandemic. And I think they need to maybe take a step back and think about, okay, this group of people that I've got here, whether it's seniors or whether it's incoming freshmen, just simply did not have the same primary and secondary education experiences. And the thing is, that's going to last for a while. Like, we haven't even gotten to the group of people who were in elementary school when COVID hit. My daughter, who's a fourth grader now, was in kindergarten, had to do kindergarten online. I mean, so like, just think about if you took a year and a half of your schooling in grade school or middle school or high school and just chucked it out the window. Like, that would have a real impact on the way, not just that you learn, but your perception of the entire artifice of education.
Yeah, it is interesting that you say that because I don't know. I mean, there has been research on the effects of COVID on students and learning, and it's really difficult to evaluate like it's only been 5 years, even though it feels like 15, and so we're still trying to figure out what that actually means, and it seems to affect all these groups differently. Like somebody who was a senior in high school, it has affected differently than somebody who was in 8th grade. It will affect differently. So it's like once we'll finally learn about what the group of students needs in time for the next group of students who were at a different point in their lives when COVID hit to have different needs, because the development across the K-12 is so diverse and so fast and needs change so rapidly. But I think it's interesting that you say that because one thing that I am seeing and hearing from my Gen Z students is that they do not want to take online classes. They want to have in person classes, but like you said, they want the class to do more than what they could do online on their own because they've already done that and they know where they're capable of. They want our classes in person to give them more and to foster connection and not just be talked to like a video that they could have watched from their house. I think that's really interesting because pre-COVID, I was getting more and more students who wanted online classes. So
Mm.
it's like people were like, okay, we actually careful what you wish for. We
Right.
don't want too much of that. And I do think that's a difference that we're seeing in those Gen Z students that were really in it when COVID hit. And I'm not sure how that will continue to develop as the different ages come through. But that's something to keep in mind is that, some of those students didn't missed some of those years where you learn how to be a student, like you said.
Yeah.
And we can't take for granted that, well, yeah, but then they had 5 more years of schooling, but they still had a significant disruption in their development in a different points in time in that development. So that's a really good point and might even play into more of this like connect with me aspect, which it kind of connects to the second point that which by the way, we're not getting through all 6. So it sounds like we're doing a part 2 of this podcast so that we don't have too long of one session for you. I don't want your workout or walk or drive to work to be an hour instead of your normal 30 minutes. So so this does kind of connect to this next idea that students don't care as much about awards and degrees and credentials that demonstrate our knowledge. They actually care about authenticity. And part of that might be built into that idea that they're craving connection because they know what it's like to not have that connection.
Yeah.
And that does, I think, a little bit change the way, the first day of class, instead of listing all your degrees and any awards you won, and I don't know if people still do that. That was my experience as a student when I met my faculty member for the first time. Maybe just tell them your story. Like you might, when somebody asks you, tell me a little bit about yourself in a job interview. Like tell them the thing that made you passionate about why you're standing in front of them today, and then work in opportunities to be like we talked about last time or a couple times ago on the podcast, to work in being a human and showing them and talking about things that have been challenging for you, or admit when you did had an assignment when you were in college that didn't go so well and what you learned from it. Like they're not going to be as impressed, at least the research suggested, they're not going to be as impressed by you being the broadcaster of the year. They're going to be more impressed by you being able to connect to them on a personal level.
Yeah, I mean, I found I get really good responses from my Gen Z students because I legitimately try to take an interest in what they're doing, what they're interested in, where they're going. A lot of them do appear to be, and I think it's dangerous to overly stereotype, but a lot of them really do appear to be looking for like an idea of how is what I'm doing going to help me get to where I want to go. And I think we see this with a lot of university strategic plans across the country right now in reaction to what they're hearing from parents and students, which is I don't I appreciate the idea that I'm coming there to learn to think, but I'm also paying you a lot of money, and for you to tell me that there's no job at the end of the rainbow is not really acceptable. And as a result of that, I'm going to go someplace that is going to tell me that. And I think that's going to we've talked about this with some other things on the podcast in earlier episodes, but it's almost like a paradigm shift of what the higher educational experience is for undergrads, which I have argued for a couple of decades now has been criminally undervalued, especially at Research One institutions, because everybody convinced themselves that it wasn't our job to help students get jobs unless you were in something like a business school or a very applied thing like a music school where it's baked in and you can't separate one from the other. So look, I think it's probably a healthy thing. Millennials kind of started the boulder rolling down the hill because they were all like, well, wait, why wouldn't we get training in this if we have to do this in order to go get a job? Gen Z's just kind of taking it to the next logical conclusion, which is I'm not even going to come there in the first place, or I'm going to be very skeptical of what you're providing me unless I can see some kind of tangible benefit. And maybe that's just thought, but you better be able to explain that if you're a professor. And I think a lot of professors are just uncomfortable with that because they haven't been asked to do that before.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that because existing on the well, this is our ranking in the US World and News and World Report, whichever direction that goes. Even at the institutional level, relying on those kind of credentials and metrics, I think you're right. The students are like, cool, good for you, but what am I getting out of this? And those are questions that maybe we weren't relying on before. When I applied to colleges, I was like, I want to go there because everything I read says that's a good school and here's all the awards they won and all the really great faculty that teach there. And I don't know that our students are as impressed by those things. Their parents might be, and their
Right.
parents might be pushing them towards certain universities to do that. But when they walk in the door, they're like, what is this experience going to be like, and am I going to get what I need to build the life that I see myself building? And that's another thing that for me, when I look at the small changes I've noticed, I actually think my Gen Z students, the freshmen that I'm talking to trying to recruit into my program, they have a vision. They might not know what job they want, but they can see the life that they want to live, and they want to know how college is going to help them get there, because the degree, they don't necessarily need to get there, but they want to know if it can help them get there. And that is a change from what we've seen in the past.
I think that's right, and that might be
It's a
a
good
good
ending.
spot to end for now, as we don't want to extend somebody's dog walk unnecessarily.
Well, we have a few more of these points to get to in teaching Gen Z and understanding Gen Z students. So we will circle back around to that on the next podcast. But thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. We appreciate all your feedback and all your comments. So please send them our way. And until next time, we're getting into, by the time you're all listening to these episodes, it'll be pushing past finals and into the summer. So I hope you're enjoying that, and we look forward to seeing you next time.